by asking each of you, as you introduce some of the work you're doing to our audience, to talk about what the current situation has added as a complicating challenge. And if I could start first with Tzeporah Berman.
Thank you, Liz, and very great to see you all. It's an honor to be here. So the project that I've been working on evolved from understanding that there are very few mechanisms within the Paris Accord to constrain fossil fuel production. And my own experience in Canada, where we have quite a progressive government that believes in climate change and put forward a climate plan that does not constrain oil and gas development in Canada, in fact, plans to increase oil and gas development, as do many wealthy nations who consider themselves climate leaders. And so in the COVID environment, back in the day before COVID, when life was somewhat more normal, we had started socializing the concept and meeting with countries. Our idea is to create an agreement between countries to cap fossil fuel expansion everywhere and manage a global just transition to wind that down. Akin to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the idea is that we need to cap expansion everywhere, and that creates a level of fairness, and then create equity principles on who gets to produce and how much we need. Right now, the UN and Stockholm Environment Institute and others report that we are currently producing 120% more fossil fuels planned to than the world can safely burn under 1.5 degrees. So with COVID, well, we haven't been able to meet face to face. A lot of our strategy had to do with international meetings, which are not happening now. But even more importantly, what we have seen with COVID is, of course, massive stimulus being planned around the world that is unprecedented at scale. And the question of how that money is being spent has become central to, I think, probably many of our strategies, and certainly ours with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we have pivoted our work to support regional partners, to engage in that debate, and to insert the concept of no expansion, which has actually been easier than we thought, because we're living in this moment where there's a stark choice. And there's a lot of even kind of conservative players that you wouldn't have thought, the IEA, et cetera, saying, let's put this stimulus money into low carbon strategies and green stimulus. But the fossil fuel industry has been organizing hard. And in some ways, they've overplayed their hand in this moment. And I think there's a general concern and recognition of the need for security and resilience. And our frame is about security. Fossil fuels are 80% of the climate change problem. The idea that fossil fuels are in fact dangerous for us and the expansion is akin to weapons of mass destruction is a frame that we think is critical in moving forward quickly, the idea of production constraints. And that's a frame that governments are more willing to consider now as everyone looks towards how can we build back better in a more kind of resilient and secure way. And I think the final thing that's really shifted everything, of course, is the oil price drop and the vulnerability of these companies and projects now. And this question of, well, who really benefits if government funding is poured into fossil fuel expansion is now more of a kitchen table conversation. Part of our work has been about changing the frame of fossil fuel expansion to being essential for the economy to, in fact, being a threat, more instability. And now that we can kind of see peak oil demand in the future, and in fact, COVID has escalated that, a lot of the decision makers that we're working with are definitely more open to that idea.
Thanks, Tzeporah. You know, making the decision and being more open to the idea isn't exactly the same as making a transition from what has been the predominant fuel source for the last 2 centuries. Into a better future. And I'd like to turn to Sebastián Kind, if I can, because he's working in particular on ways to help increase the capacity of those willing states to actually move in a more accelerated version. Sebastián, could you describe about your breakthrough idea and also what now it means in terms of COVID, where so much of the public treasury is going for other aspects of recovery to help overcome some of the misery that this pandemic has created, what are the specific challenges that you're encountering as you move forward on the dialogues that are necessary for leaders to embrace new fuel sources and cleaner fuel sources?
Sure. Thank you, Liz, very much for this opportunity. It's really my great pleasure to be in this conference. I really appreciate it. As you may know, GreenMap is a non-profit organization created to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy in developing economies. And COVID, of course, is creating new things, is creating a new scenario for the whole world, but mainly for the developing economies. As we were even discussing before, the situation that some or even most of the developing economies are experiencing in terms of economic development is being restricted. There is a huge drop in GDP and there is a huge restriction in a lot of senses. So in terms of the strategy that we are conducting, there are basically two different things I would like to differentiate. One is the strategy itself and the different stages in which GreenMap is working on. We are right now in the second stage, which is the development of the product itself. So it is a right moment to incorporate new things according to what we understand is going to happen. And the second bucket, the second thing is exactly this. I mean, what we understand that's going to happen in the post-pandemic for the sector. So on the first side, of course, there are a lot of differences, starting from what we are designing as, for instance, the fundraising efforts that, of course, we didn't prepare ourselves for going in any virtual mode. And of course, now this is what is going to happen because we are not able, we don't think that's going to be a good idea to postpone a lot of things in this regard. But for communication purposes as well, of course, the communication is key. I mean, we know that GreenMap must be known and the way we communicate will be very different compared to what we have designed. That is, as Tzeporah said before, we imagine a world full of international meetings that might not happen in the coming months or even years. So we know that there's a challenge for a new organization like GreenMap also in how to position within crowded ongoing agendas, where perhaps climate will not be a priority according to other priorities that mainly in developing economies that will happen, and not even energy, which is our core sector, our core business. So that's another thing. And perhaps the third is that, of course, we need to reinforce the concept of leveraging resources through alternative instruments like warranties, which is our core, our kernel within GreenMap. We know that there are specific funds, so the role of the national development banks or even more bilateral or even multilateral institutions will be under profound claim to be a real actor behind the recovery of from COVID, the recovery from COVID. So leveraging the fact that through a proper set of instruments, they might allocate resources in a much better way. It is now even more than before something that we need to reinforce, and we understand we need to reinforce as part of our strategy. In the second bucket, which is what we understand is going to happen in the post-pandemic, I'm very optimistic for different reasons. One is that we are in a world of low rates, which is great for capital-intensive infrastructure projects, because you know that when you face a low rate, that means that at the end of the story will finish in low tariffs because of the way these kind of projects are structured. So this is one very interesting thing. The second, I would say, is that although it's true that is, of course, as we know, a drop in the price in the oil and gas sector, it is also true that domestically speaking, for those markets that they do have production of oil and gas, the prices are forced to be artificially set, and this is thanks to the fact that there are thousands of jobs behind the oil and gas sector that will not be in place without an artificial value, or without putting prices in an artificial way. And this is a competition. And in a competition system, this will play again on favor to the renewable energy sector. There are a couple of extra things. So I would say that also renewables in most of the markets are experiencing the concept of the priority of dispatch, which means that for any investor in the energy sector, generally speaking, in a context or in a scenario where there is a drop in the power demand, as we are experiencing today for the constraint in the economic situation around the world, having a priority of dispatch means that there is a big opportunity behind renewables for those that are today trying to incorporate renewable energy. It is not going to be easy, because energy perhaps is not going to be in the agenda for the next coming months or even years in most of the governments. But within the energy sector and within the economy, I think that there's a huge opportunity. So that's the reason mainly I'm very optimistic. There are a couple of extra things. There is a full equipment supply in the world, so the reach of high quality and cheap equipment is everywhere, and not only speaking about China, but everywhere. So there's a drop in prices as well that the industry might take advantage of. And as said before, the large institutional investors that are increasing their exposure to clean investment is, of course, in our favor. COVID, there's a trend that will only improve in a post-COVID scenario. And we know that although it's not going to be smooth and easy, I'm quite optimistic. COVID might result rather than in a constraint that play definitely in our favor.
So you feel that priority dispatch, low interest rates, low fuel prices for fossil fuel, and equally low or lower prices for renewables makes it an interesting combination for leaders to choose this as a recovery model.
Definitely.
And will supply be able to keep up with it, I guess, is one of the questions.
No, that's definitely, I mean, I know that it's not going to be easy for a lot of reasons that we are discussing, but we are very optimistic, which doesn't mean that we don't have to accommodate or add extra condiments to our strategy. Of course, we do have to do it, but we understand that there is a huge opportunity thanks to COVID for this to happen. And this is quite unique, perhaps for the peculiarity, for the particular things that this industry has.
Okay, thank you, Sebastián. I'd love to turn now to Bruce Nilles, who has a very particular challenge dealing with natural gas in the United States. Bruce, you are in a very fraught environment, and one where old habits die hard. Can you describe for us some of the challenges that you were facing even before you took this on, before COVID, and what new challenges COVID has brought to your endeavors?
Sure. Thank you, Liz, and thank you to Breakthrough for this terrific opportunity. So the project I started working on about 18 months ago was honestly a whole new area to me. I had spent the prior almost 2 decades working on retiring and replacing coal-fired power plants as one key way to both cut carbon and reduce air pollution around the globe. And in the United States and in much of the world, we're actually making good progress on retiring and replacing coal. Turns out we're not making a lot of progress in other sectors in our economy. And the one I particularly started digging into was around the use of fossil fuels in buildings. And the amazing revelation to me, despite working on climate for many years, was that the 4 gas appliances in my home turned out to be the biggest piece of my carbon footprint. And I never knew that. And we haven't been talking about it. and it's a big piece of both the outdoor carbon problem as well as an air pollution problem. And that's where the connection to COVID gets particularly interesting, relevant, scary, in that one of the things we know is that the death rate for COVID goes up dramatically for people living in polluted areas. And so there is strong evidence that if you've been living in a place where we have been burning lots of dirty fossil fuels, whether it's diesel in London, coal in Delhi, your lungs are more likely to be susceptible to extreme consequences from COVID. Now, at the same time with COVID, one of the results has been dramatic reduction in economic activity, which has meant a lot less fossil fuels and cleaner air to many of our cities that haven't seen clean air in a very long time. And so it's really brought home this connection of fossil fuels are the reason we can't breathe in many of our cities. And it's really helped elevate the conversation around, we really don't have to, this is not the normal. Seeing the mountains in the distance from your favorite city or location can be done if we can accelerate this transition away from fossil fuels. The other piece I would flag in the time of COVID is that we're spending a lot more time indoors. We used to spend on average 90% of our time indoors. I don't know about all of you, but I feel like I'm spending 99% of my time indoors. We don't regulate indoor air quality. And the burning of fossil fuels, particularly fossil fuels for cooking indoors in the United States, the Western world, and around the globe, is actually a huge source of exposure to residents that gets a lot less attention than it should. One of the projects I worked on the last 6 months was with my former colleagues at Rocky Mountain Institute and a couple of partner organizations, was really pulling together all the science around the dangers of burning fossil fuels in our buildings and what that means for human health indoors. So in this time of COVID, we're indoors. We know that risk of air pollution can increase the risk of significant COVID impacts. It's actually opening up a conversation opportunity around the wisdom of having fossil fuels both in and around our buildings in ways that we had never predicted. So that is one opportunity in this otherwise awful moment. If people are thinking about how safe is our home when we go inside and shelter in place, we should be thinking a lot about how and where we're burning fossil fuels around our communities. Now, in terms of the work, in the US and around much of the world, everything basically shut down for several weeks, and we sort of re-emerged into a world of Zoom. And so a quick update on sort of how COVID has, how work continues despite COVID. So a lot of the work has been at the city and state level here in the United States in the absence of federal leadership on climate. And right before COVID hit in February, there was a lot of momentum in the United States for cities and states leading on climate, wanting to do their part, and thinking about not only replacing coal and gas plants with clean energy, but also how do we decarbonize the building environment. Cities were saying, we're not going to build new buildings with gas. That doesn't make any sense in a world where we're trying to accelerate the transition. That work all stopped and is now being picking up again, which I think is sort of a testament to our resilience despite the COVID times. So we had a city last week that, despite not being able to meet in person, has been doing a lot of public meetings and engagement with its citizens around how it can become the next city that's thinking about how to phase out fossil fuels within its city limits. So the work is continuing. It is now sort of obviously in a whole new venue, and in line with what both Sebastián and Tzeporah mentioned, there's also this huge global opportunity around stimulus. How do we put people back to work? How do we build back better? In Europe, and I don't know if Tessa's going to touch on this, the European Green Deal is $1 trillion of potential new investment aligned with, if all goes to plan, a new commitment with a lower carbon target for 2030. So there's really the example of a continent that as a whole is saying, we need to accelerate progress on climate. it is the next pandemic that is coming. And we're going to use it as an opportunity to really stimulate the economy, help people get back to work, and do so in a way that is leaving behind the fossil fuels of old, and also doing it in a way that is helping the workers make the transition. So a big piece of what has been going on in Europe, as many of you may know, is, for example, in Germany, how to help the coal mining regions make the transition. So not forgetting them, leaving them behind, but actually being very deliberate about not only transitioning off of fossil fuels, but making sure the workers and the affected communities have the same economic opportunity that everyone else does. So these are very strange times, but I do see a lot of shoots of spring, if you will, showing that in a time where we're becoming much more aware of fossil fuels and has profound impacts on our local community, we can actually take this moment and rebuild back in a much better way.
That's a really very hopeful way to describe a hugely complex problem, Bruce, particularly intriguing about how the local jurisdictions have a lot to say and a lot of actionable steps that they can take. As you were mentioning, the part about just transition, in particular in Europe, of course, naturally many people are thinking about the justice in this moment. Will we actually see a just transition, and who is included in that? I'd love to now turn to Tessa Khan, who works on issues of justice and litigation. And just to pose the first question to you, Tessa, this normally when public leaders see the prospect of a lawsuit coming their way, they're naturally sort of ready for it. But at this moment, when they're handling so many things, what do you think the reaction and the temperament of public leaders will be to address law cases? And how will the courts manage these things as well? What do you see as the big frame in this challenge as so many other things are hitting the windscreen?
Thanks so much, Liz. It's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation and to see so many of you again. So I think really to turn to the first part of that question, which relates to how public leaders will respond to a climate-related challenge in addition to all of the other economic policy challenges and social security challenges and health challenges that they're dealing with, is just to say that they have had plenty of notice. And that they certainly shouldn't be surprised. And I think in this moment, they should be expecting these challenges to be coming, because I think those of us in civil society, working with social movements, I think there have been two things that have really added additional impetus to our demands around climate at this moment. The first is, of course, that the pandemic has made it so clear how vulnerable we all are in terms of our health and our livelihoods to systemic crises, and that it doesn't matter how rich your country is, how developed your economies are, we're all deeply vulnerable, and that the inequalities that exist in all of our societies will only be magnified in moments of crisis. So I think, those of us who think about climate change feel more motivated than ever to make sure that we don't have another crisis that obviously will make COVID-19 look like child's play, really, coming down the pike in the next decade or, years to come. So that's, I think, one thing that's adding additional fuel to the fire in terms of the demands that are being made around ambition on climate change. The second thing is that, the ability of the state to intervene in the economy has been laid bare in a way that certainly has no precedent in my lifetime. I don't think it's precedented for generations. And in the UK, the government is currently paying the wages of 11 million people. It is keeping the real economy afloat. It's keeping the financial sector afloat. So we know that the only thing that's been standing in the way of the transition that we know is necessary at the speed and the scale that we know is necessary. And governments doing that is political will, because, given the right circumstances, they have done what was needed. So I think that is going to add additional impetus to the demands, and that governments know that there is more transparency around what the state can do in a moment of crisis than there's ever been. As for how courts will receive these claims, so they are certainly continuing to come. Most recently, we supported a case against the South Korean government, which is the first case of its kind in East Asia, asking the government to align its 2030 emissions reduction target with the Paris Agreement's temperature goals, in short. And that case was filed on March the 15th in the thick of the pandemic, the press conference where the 21 students who filed the case was held, everyone was wearing face masks and it was social distancing, and but none of that has gotten in the way of young people and communities who are vulnerable to climate change filing lawsuits against governments demanding that they do more. I think one of the challenges for those of us who work on litigation against governments that's always been a big challenge is that courts are generally very anxious about being seen to be making policy and encroaching on the role of policymakers and legislatures. And so they get very nervous when you put a problem to them that requires them to come up with a resolution that will have implications for industrial policy, that will have implications for fiscal policy. And I think one of our initial concerns after the pandemic hit and it became clear what the scale of the economic crisis was going to be is that courts are going to be even more nervous now that they know that the screws have really tightened in terms of the financial resources that are available to governments, that they're going to be even more wary about being seen to be directing how governments should be prioritising expenditure. But actually, I mean, what we saw just a couple of weeks ago in a case that was heard in the Supreme Court of Ireland that we also supported. So that was a case, Ireland might seem like an unusual target, but despite being very green, it has the third highest level of per capita emissions of any European country, a very powerful agricultural lobby, and so on. And so there was an Irish NGO that brought a case arguing that the Irish government's national mitigation plan, which is the main plank in its mitigation policy, was incompatible with the human rights of Irish residents. And the court asked, that one of the Supreme Court judges asked the government to justify how it is that Ireland's emissions are projected to increase over the course of that national mitigation plan's lifetime, which is over the next 5 years, with the fact that Ireland has an emissions reduction target of 80 to 100% in 2050, right? Those numbers really just don't add up. And the judge in question said to the government's council, isn't there an annual year-on-year plan for reducing emissions to actually meet that long-term target? And the government said, well no, there isn't actually. And the government's and the court, the judge said, well, you had to have a year-on-year plan after the last financial crisis to reduce Ireland's debt ratio, which was demanded by the Troika. So actually, after the last financial crisis, the court saw that the government was capable of coming up with a greater level of transparency around its fiscal priorities, and demanded that accountability from the government, in the context of climate change. So actually, I think courts have been emboldened in this moment because they've also seen that governments do have the power when they feel sufficiently motivated to address crises in a way that is commensurate with what's required in the moment. So actually, we think it might be a good thing ultimately for these cases.
And do you think that the courts in one country listen and observe the court behavior in another country as well?
Oh, yeah, we know that they do. I mean, they openly cite the decisions of other countries in their own judgments. And because there are still only a handful of these cases that challenge the overall emissions reductions targets of governments, they're looking to each other to see how they deal with these tricky questions around, what's kind of off the table in terms of policy making, and how do we deal with the complexity of the fair share question, for example, and so on. So no, they're very much looking to each other at the moment.
So this is a pretty hopeful frame, even in cases where courts might be reticent in some ways. We have all seen that the public sector has now taken a front and center role in our lives, which means they can quickly become the heroes that they've always wanted to be if we press for their better angels. So I'm going to turn back to Tzeporah now and talk about where the public pressure comes from so that they can be their better angels, those public officials. Can you tell us, Tzeporah, about how the global structures are formulating around the public pressure, where it particularly applies in the work of STAND, and how you see, Tessa, for example, mentioned 21 Korean students that were responsible for a brief, and we see this in so many different areas where young people in particular are pressing. But there is a broader public just beyond the youth as well. Tell us a little bit about how this plays out in your work.
Well, there's been a kind of, I think we're seeing a necessary, well, certainly within our project, what we're seeing is a necessary and kind of quite radical shift in the way that we think about how we structure ourselves and global projects. And I think it's in part because like everyone and every institution, the experience of COVID, along with the drop in oil prices and the kind of paralysis of transportation globally and then therefore drop in oil demand and all the changes that we've seen in our lives have, I think, made everyone realize that we need structures that allow for fluidity, that built into our systems and in our conversations with each other and how we organize and how we structure projects and even international institutions, we need to be able to address major changes in demand and political landscape. And we also need to have greater, in some ways, coordination and calls for responses that are commensurate with the state of the problem. So what I'm seeing in kind of mobilization and movement building is a lot more conversations about the role of government. I think prior to COVID, there was a big push around financial institutions, and that is essential. And that work will continue, and it actually has greater momentum because the fossil fuel companies are just doing so poorly. Divestment has now become a fiduciary responsibility in many cases. But we also see the limits of just allowing the markets to decide our future and the need for both government intervention and global coordination. And so, you know, we've been meeting with youth organizations around the world about the idea of the treaty. And we have now youth organizations in 10 countries considering running treaty campaigns in the coming year, because while they want to call for responsibility and will from banks and financial institutions, we can't let governments off the hook. And what are we asking governments to do? And so having the idea of having a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty in parallel to the Paris Accord that forces governments to be transparent about the stockpile that we're creating has really lifted up. And based on the kind of excitement from youth groups and other civil society groups from around the world, you know, really pushed the academics we're working with to think about what does transparency mean. And so next month we'll be releasing a white paper on calling for a global registry of fossil fuels. What's kind of crazy is that governments are not required to actually say how much fossil fuels they're planning on building or who's building them. And therefore we have no global accounting. So just getting back to basics around transparency and accounting will become one of our big policy pushes moving forward, which really emerged, I think, from our conversations with civil society. But I think the big piece of shift around international institutions and their role. I mean, we can't forget that in other moments of great disruption, I mean, think back to the Second World War, that's how the UN was created. It's how the ILO, the International Labor Organization, was created. And I think this lived experience of, in some ways, a failure of global cooperation around COVID is forcing people to rethink. And also the lived experience of how bad it is in many countries and how they're not equipped to deal with both the market crashes and COVID. And what does that mean for international institutions like the IMF, the role of debt and debt forgiveness? And I think when we look at climate change, that's incredibly important because there are a lot of countries who actually want to do the right thing right now. If you look at Ecuador, you know, they're the first country to actually acknowledge the rights of nature. They signed the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet right now on the books, despite wanting to build better infrastructure for the country, they're planning new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon. and they're in the buffer zones of uncontacted nations, but not because they want to, because they have to, because of debt for oil swaps with China. So this idea that somehow every country can coordinate to reduce emissions and then do their own just transition is actually impossible. We need a globally negotiated just transition, and we need to review what international institutions and agreements that we have in order to get there. And I think this moment of great disruption gives us that opportunity, but we really need to be calling on governments to change. And we've seen a lot of creativity from civil society with online rallies of thousands of people and new digital, I mean, at Stand.Earth, but in every organization I'm working with around the world, 100% of our work went digital. And it created a lot of creativity in movement building. But I think, to be honest, it's also taken some steam out of the growing, powerful climate movement. I mean, before COVID, we saw more people marching in the streets around the world millions than we had ever seen before. The student strikes had lit a fire under people, of course, as did the impacts from fires in Australia to California, et cetera. And I think that is going to take some time post-COVID to build back and to gain the attention of governments because they're so focused necessarily on health, on their citizens' health issues, but also on the stimulus. So I think it's a very challenging moment for climate movement building and mobilization, but there are opportunities.
Yeah, and even as it progresses online digitally, the movement building isn't necessarily as picked up by the media, which then gets the attention that it had when it was in the physical formation of a protest. And that can be another area where professional journalists just have to clue in a different way and cover it. I wanted to ask if I could ask you a follow-up question, Tzeporah. One of the things that strikes me about the work that you're doing is, by creating a non-proliferation treaty, it is an instrument that is obligatory, which stands in direct contrast to the Paris Agreement, which is essentially voluntary. And by positioning an obligatory treaty, you have to get the signatories, of course. There would presumably be the inventory regimes you talked about and the inspection regimes to monitor that, which once you inventory it, then it might help what Tessa described as the Irish problem a bit advance and accelerate, because they have to plan around the inventory and then plan consciously to decrease what they've named. But do you see any tension, because at the same time, with obligatory treaties and with work against international institutions, there have also been, over the last decades, a lot of negative associations, a lot of negative perceptions about the worth and the integrity of international institutions. And many of our classic, whether it's the ICBM treaty or others, the kinds of non-proliferation treaties that have existed before have proven to not always carry the strength when a rogue regime wants to violate them. So what do you see as some of the big challenges, and how will you square some of those circles?
What's been really interesting about researching a number of the treaties, non-proliferation, chemical weapons ban, et cetera, has been that it's been in the process of creating the conversation about the treaty that we've seen the most movement. So I think we're even just the throwing out the idea of the non-proliferation treaty right now, and the steps towards it, like the global registry of fossil fuels, is creating a conversation about whether or not it's okay to continue to stockpile fossil fuels and lock us in to infrastructure, both political and physical, that leads to more fossil fuel burning. And so, you know, of course, when you look down the road and say, you know, would China and the U.S. Sign a non-proliferation treaty, and how would we regulate that? There are some massive barriers and questions, but the process of getting towards, for example, a global registry, I think is entirely viable. Most countries that we've talked to have said, oh, transparency and accountability and global accounting. Well, yeah, we should do that. We don't do that. What's been fascinating to me is I'm actually meeting with countries who are like, it's true, we don't do that. We don't. We have an emissions gap report. You know, we don't have this registry of production. We don't know what's being created. And so it creates how much fossil fuels are being produced and by whom as a political conversation globally. And the result will be bilateral discussions. It will inform financial decisions because financial institutions will get worried that there will be future constraints. We think it will also escalate nation state activities. We don't like the idea of a treaty, but it's true. We haven't been regulating production. Maybe we should do this and that. And so the idea is to escalate the whole movement of the conversation towards building a community of practice around constraining fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are being constrained. And in fact, as a result of oil price, we saw what it looks like when supply side countries are in the middle of an unmanaged decline. Governments aren't planning for it. Thousands are out of work. They haven't done competitiveness studies. They haven't created plans for how to employ these people and retrain them. And it's a disaster. And so part of what we're trying to do is create a conversation about the need for a managed and planned wind down of fossil fuels, and to create multilateral and bilateral conversations about that. What we're envisioning post the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels, the next step would be something akin to the World Commission on Dams. We're designing the principles for a World Commission on Fossil Fuels. So the treaty is also a platform to create the right pathway and conversations to a global conversation of winding down fossil fuel production. And so yes, there will be major political challenges and in the long term in getting a treaty. But the steps along the way will help us escalate the potential of keeping the world safe.
Mm-hmm. Tzeporah, one of the things that you say just about the simple act of creating the inventory and public officials saying we don't have that, we didn't know, sounds akin to our colleague Bruce, who it dawned on him how much damage there was being done just by gas in his own home and how great a cause it is. There is a huge amount of generalized awareness we have about the problems, but not the specific ways, and only once we specify them can we solve them. By the same token, I sort of think sometimes that your work and Sebastián's work are like perfect bookends. You're working to de-escalate, and Sebastián, if I can turn back to you, you're going on the escalation path, how we actually bring more of the clean energy that will create jobs, greater investment, greater prosperity cycles into countries that need them so much. But if I can tail it with the question I was asking Tzeporah about movement building and those same activists that are casting doubt on what exists and possibly the institutions that go with them, and there's a test of faith there. How do you look at activists as either helping your, on the tail of what Tzeporah is doing, helping your cause to incur greater public investment and private investment in renewable energy, and in what ways could it be an obstacle to what you're doing if uninformed protest is moving forward? Do you see any evidence of that so far, or do you see the movement building actually only adding to the positives that help public officials do the right thing?
I would say there is a joint effort. I mean, one of the things interesting behind this is that we are in a world of great uncertainty. And great uncertainty driven by high volatility in the financial markets. So every industry, and particularly renewables, that might offer investors lower annualized volatility compared to other sectors might play in favor to public officials. So basically, it is a joint effort that not only from the industry side, but also from the governmental side to see the benefits of what we are talking about. So that's one of the things. The other thing is, of course, the potential of job creation in, as you said before, in the renewable energy sector, so especially distributed and some extent local manufacturing in larger markets. So this is very important in the recovery stimulus policy design, because we know that it's going to be a challenge to recover from COVID around these topics. And of course, the industry in which we are participating might be a real actor in this kind of thing. So I think this is another interesting things that governors and officials in governments might be benefit of stimulating in the policy design. And perhaps to add an extra thing is to say that our work in Greenbaum has the challenge of changing the, I would say, attractiveness of different markets to long-term investment, particularly in the renewable energy arena. But if successful, we surely permit other sectors that need investment as well to happen. So in a post-pandemic world, I would say that where governments will have increased financial needs, any action to improve attractiveness might be very helpful, and that encourages us to work even harder, of course, but that will be really interesting. So once again, I'm very optimistic for the benefit that it brings to the governors and the officials in the governments in the post-pandemic recovery, and for the sector that is of course pushing for this to happen as well. So that's basically what I'm seeing.
Do you feel that there is going to be any constraint on capital at certain points? I mean, you, in your opening remarks, we were talking about the low interest rate environment and everything else. Will there be a moment where, whether it's public or private investment, people just say, sorry, there's no more, or the price of it will start going up? Are those real fears, or are they fears that you feel that people might stoke adversely, in an adverse way against what you're trying to do?
I would say that there's a great saying that says that money is everywhere. What we don't have is a good pipeline of projects. So it's not that money is everywhere and is infinite. Of course, it's not. But I feel that the constraint will not come from the capital market itself, but for the allocation of the capital in different kinds of projects. So, of course, capital is capital. It has no friends, as other saying says. And it is interesting to understand how to divert the extant amount of capital towards or to the sector that we really want to, as climate infrastructure, the one we are working on. So more than a restriction, I would say there is a space, there is room for innovative solutions that might bring capital to the sectors that we understand is good for everyone.
It's a wonderful thought, and I know that many funders deal with this all the time. You can see so many innovators, so many entrepreneurs, and then the investors pause and say, but you're not at the scale that we can actually put money, you're too small. So it's about scale as well as innovation, right? We have to encourage every group out there that is working to, in fact, join up and start creating bigger responses to what they're doing. Yes, please. Sorry.
This is not only for the renewable energy sector. I mean, this is for any long-term infrastructure project that you want to implement in the long run, which is the right way to do it. And in terms of clean technology, which is in favor to the climate, of course, not only renewables, but the rest of the infrastructure that we can speak about, the kind of innovative solutions that we are working on play definitely on favor. So once again, I'm very optimistic, although I know it's not going to be easy. I never expect this to be easy anyway. So definitely, yes, we are optimistic.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very mindful that an hour is far too little to hear from these amazing fellows. And I think Tzeporah alluded to this about thinking of us as the post-war experiment, the kind of Marshall plans, the very big long-term thinking where dramatic changes can happen. And each of our fellows, of course, is in that 10-year mind frame. Nothing gets solved tomorrow. You have to have the kind of patience and tenacity to be able to drill down on a problem whose solution is so profound for humanity that it will create a real true breakthrough. And so I'd like to ask each panelist in the remaining time, knowing that 10 years still feels very far off, even 5 years feels far off, but signals along the way do matter. So if we were going to have this same webinar a year from now, July 2nd, 2021, what kind of signals will you see in each of your areas that will indicate to us that we are moving in the right direction, that the Marshall Plan of our climate dreams is actually happening. And I'm going to start with Bruce.
Let me unmute. I guess there's a couple things. One is COVID has laid bare, as a couple of speakers have said, the incredible vulnerability of the fossil fuel sector and the economies that rely on them. Here in the United States, coal use used to be half of our electricity generation. This year it will be 17%, and a new round of bankruptcies. It is exposing that the coal industry in the US is on its final legs. So a year from now, I expect we'll have elected a new president who cares about climate. Life will be much better. We'll join with the European community and other countries around the world, engaging China, and collectively be bringing carbon emissions down in a very speedy and fair way, in ways that we've never done before. But I think the exposure COVID has made to big parts of our fossil fuel economy provide the opening that Tzeporah talked about to really think about doing something at scale that we haven't done before, and it's good for our economy and for our climate.
Thanks, Bruce. Tessa.
Thanks, Liz. So I think, I mean, the simple answer is, you know, this time in 2021, we will have wanted to have won some more cases. That's the goal. But ultimately, I think, like everyone on this panel, I would like my job to be redundant. I mean, I don't want to have to file cases. Nobody wants to have to do this work. If policymakers were doing the right thing, then we could all be pursuing our alternative passions, whatever they might be. But I think, you know, what this moment really calls for is for us to think very hard about whether or not a 10-year timeline is good enough. I mean, the head of the IEA, you know, who's not exactly a climate activist, said recently that, you know, governments will be spending $9 trillion in the next 6 months, and those decisions will basically determine whether or not we can meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think the next 6 months and the extent to which governments feel like they're being held accountable, whether that's by social movements, whether that's via legal imperatives or other, you know, sources of pressure, I think is really going to be the test of whether or not we're succeeding. And, you know, if the language of, you know, Paris proofing investments or compatibility with those temperature goals, if that's really starting to infiltrate, I think, policy making, then we know that we'll be on the right track.
Thank you. Tzeporah.
I think probably by July 2021, we will see more countries making statements like we've seen from New Zealand and France and Ireland about constraining production. This is kind of the new wave of climate leadership. I think that's only going to pick up speed in the next year. We're also, I think, we will see more calls for multilateral coordination to stop fossil fuel production. You know, like we saw from Mary Robinson this year at the UN Security Council, but I think we're going to start to see leaders of nation states. This will likely emerge from the most vulnerable nations. By a year from now, we will have a vibrant public mobilization and movement building campaign around the treaty. Our goal is over 1,000 organizations endorsed within a year, over hundreds of cities endorsing the fossil fuel treaty within a year. And 1 million citizens signed up to the campaign within a year. And within a year, we'll have the first prototype of the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels produced and live.
It'll be something to look forward to. And Sebastián, last but not least, where will we be in July 2021?
I think that, sorry, I'm at home. I see that we will see also countries more open than before to this kind of innovative solutions than those we are trying to implement. And that's very good. That's one also the reasons why I'm so optimistic. The second thing is that in the DFI arena, in the development financial institutions, they will also be very keen to understand how to leveraging the extant funds they have, because they will act they will be forced to act in the recovery of post-COVID. So these kind of things will be key for them to understand how to make the extant capital they allocate to different economies in more efficient way. And in the in terms of what Green Map might be in a year time, I'm expecting to be deploying in the first market at least what we are designing. So basically our product.
Well, I look forward to hearing all of these stories a year from now. And I want to extend my thanks to Sebastián Kind and Tzeporah Berman, Tessa Khan and Bruce Nilles for what a privilege it is to listen to you describe your work, even in the face of this horrible pandemic. We hope for a better future, but we know that you guys are going to be some of the leading lights that are going to take us there. Savannah, can I turn back to you to close us out?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you all so much for your time, for all of our wonderful awardees. Thank you, Liz, for moderating and facilitating this conversation. And to all of our attendees, thank you so much. We will be having webinars in the future. If you're interested in more information about the Climate Breakthrough Project and the work that our awardees are doing, please visit us at climatebreakthroughproject.org. And I wish you all well at staying sane and healthy in these difficult times.